Possess my witness to evil in a sacred place. The devil hides in plain sight. That's the truth I've learned after 30 years of organizing spiritual retreats throughout Mexico. What I witnessed that night in the chapel outside Monterrey proved to me that genuine evil exists, and it aggressively seeks to destroy what's sacred. I'm sharing this story publicly for the first time, though it's haunted my dreams for over 2 decades. Those who were present that night made a pact of silence, worried our testimony would either be dismissed as religious hysteria, or worse, that speaking of it might somehow invite that darkness back into our lives. But silence protects no one, and some burdens weren't meant to be carried alone. My name is Magdalena Cortez. I was just 20 years old and serving as a junior retreat coordinator when it happened. Back then, I was still naive, filled with unshakable faith and the certainty that good always prevails against evil. I believed evil was an abstract concept, not something you could see taking possession of someone's body right before your eyes. The retreat center was a converted hacienda dating back to the 1800s, nestled in the foothills, 3 hours outside Monterrey. Local residents called it La Casa de los Santos, the House of Saints, though its official name was Centro Espiritual Santa Teresa. The property belonged to the diocese and had served as a sanctuary for spiritual gatherings since the 1950s. It was remote, isolated enough that participants could disconnect from the outside world and focus entirely on their spiritual journey. This particular retreat was for married couples. 15 pairs had arrived on Thursday evening, many looking weary from their daily struggles. Marriage retreats were always the most challenging. Unlike youth retreats filled with energy and optimism, these were attended by people carrying the weight of real-life disappointments, financial struggles, infidelity, loss of children addiction. They came seeking renewal, hoping to rediscover what had been buried beneath years of resentment and routine. By Saturday evening, our third night, the atmosphere had transformed. The initial guardedness had melted away as couples shared their struggles and received compassion rather than judgment. There's something powerful about collective vulnerability. It creates a sacred space where healing can begin. Father Domingo Vasquez, our spiritual director, had planned a special communion service for that evening. It would be held in the hacienda's original chapel, a small stone structure with thick walls and narrow windows that filtered the evening light into dusty golden beams. The chapel could accommodate about 50 people, with worn wooden pews arranged in a semicircle around a modest altar. Behind the altar stood a hand-carved wooden crucifix, its details softened by time, but its expression of suffering still arrestingly vivid. This place has seen 2 centuries of prayers, Father Domingo told me earlier that day as we prepared the chapel. The walls themselves are saturated with faith. I remember thinking how poetic that sounded. Later, I would wonder if those walls had absorbed other things, 2 darker energies that had been waiting for the right vessel to emerge through. We began gathering in the chapel at 8:30 p.m. I'd arranged votive candles throughout the space, their flames dancing in the slight draft that whispered through the old building. The scent of beeswax mingled with the distinctive smell of aged wood and stone, that unmistakable church smell that somehow feels eternal. Outside, the sky had transformed into a canvas of deep indigo with no moon to illuminate the surrounding countryside. The retreat center was perched on a hillside overlooking miles of scrubland and distant mountains. No neighboring properties, no passing traffic, no cell service. The nearest town was 45 minutes away on a good day. We were completely on our own. Perfect conditions for confronting your soul, Father Domingo had said with a smile when we first arrived. No distractions, nowhere to hide from yourself or from God. That isolation had felt comforting at first. Now, as I recall the events that unfolded, I realize how terrifyingly vulnerable we were. The couples filed in silently, each carrying a small, unlit candle. They sat close to their spouses, many holding hands, a visible sign of the reconnection that had begun to take root. The chapel's ancient ceiling fans turned lazily overhead, barely disturbing the heavy summer air. The old wiring in the building meant the lights occasionally flickered, something we'd all grown accustomed to over the previous days. I positioned myself near the back wall, where I could observe and ensure everything proceeded smoothly. Sister Beatrice, a serene woman in her 60s who had been organizing these retreats for decades, stood beside me. She had a clipboard with the evening schedule, though she rarely needed to consult it. After hundreds of retreats, the rhythm was embedded in her bones. "Watch for Elena Delgado," Sister Beatrice whispered to me. "She had a difficult breakthrough during confession this afternoon. Father Domingo says she's carrying something heavy." My eyes found Elena in the third row, a petite woman with long dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. She was 32, married to Marco, a construction foreman with gentle eyes and work-roughened hands. They had been attempting to conceive a child for 7 years without success. The strain had nearly broken their marriage. As the service began, I noticed Elena shifting uncomfortably in her seat. Her posture was rigid, her shoulders tense. Marco leaned close to her, whispering something in her ear, but she didn't respond. She stared straight ahead at the crucifix, unblinking. "She hasn't been sleeping well," Marco had confided earlier that day during our group sharing session. "She wakes up at exactly 3:17 every morning, convinced someone is calling her name." Father Domingo started with a reading from Ephesians, his voice resonating in the stone chamber. "Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." The words seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have. I remember feeling a chill despite the evening heat. The main overhead light, a wrought iron chandelier with electric candle bulbs, flickered once, twice, then stabilized. Nothing unusual for this old building, but then it happened again, more insistently, like someone rapidly flipping a switch. "Must be the wiring," I whispered to Sister Beatrice. "This place has been here since the 1800s. She nodded, but her expression remained troubled. Sister Beatrice had been at this longer than almost anyone else. She once told me she could smell when something wasn't right, like farmers who can sense approaching rain hours before the clouds appear. The air suddenly felt heavy, like the atmospheric pressure before a thunderstorm. The flames of the votive candles stood perfectly still despite the ceiling fans. I found myself taking shallow breaths as though the oxygen had thinned. Father Domingo continued the service, inviting everyone to light their personal candles as a symbol of Christ's light in their marriages. The ritual had always been moving, watching the light spread from person to person until the entire chapel glowed with dozens of individual flames united in purpose. But when Father Domingo approached Elena with the flame, she recoiled. It was subtle, just a slight flinching backward, but in that small movement I sensed profound unease. Marco noticed too, his brow furrowing with concern as he gently guided her hands to accept the light. "It's all right, mi amor," I heard him whisper. "Just breathe." She allowed her candle to be lit, but her hands trembled so violently that hot wax spilled onto her fingers. She didn't react to what must have been painful burns. Instead, she stared at the flame with an expression I couldn't interpret, something between fascination and dread. Father Domingo continued moving through the congregation, but his eyes kept returning to Elena. There was a silent communication between him and Sister Beatrice, the slightest nod that told me they were monitoring the situation. As the service progressed toward communion, we arranged ourselves in a circle around the Santissimo, the consecrated host displayed in an ornate golden monstrance at the center of the chapel. In Catholic tradition, this is the physical presence of Christ, the most sacred element of our faith. I helped move the monstrance from the tabernacle to a small table draped in white linen at the center of our circle. As I placed it down, I noticed my own hands were unsteady. There was no reason for my nervousness. I'd performed this task countless times, yet I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched by something other than the 40 people in the room. The chapel's acoustics created strange echoes during our prayers. Words seemed to bounce back altered, as if the stone walls were absorbing some syllables and reflecting others. Several times I thought I heard additional voices, whispers beneath our collective prayer that followed a different cadence. Probably just the way sound travels in here, I told myself, though I didn't believe it. Elena stood directly across from me in the circle. I couldn't help watching her. Her lips moved in prayer, but her eyes darted around the room as if tracking something invisible to the rest of us. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the evening's relative coolness. Marco kept his arm around her waist, steadying her, though she seemed increasingly resistant to his touch. We were halfway through the Lord's Prayer when the first undeniable sign appeared. "Deliver us from evil," we recited in unison. At these words, Elena's head snapped up. Her eyes, which had been downcast in prayer, now fixed on the monstrance with such intensity that I instinctively looked to see what she might be seeing. The sacred vessel appeared normal gold gleaming in the candlelight. But Elena was seeing something else, something that made her breath quicken and her body stiffen. "No," she whispered, barely audible over our continued prayer. "No, no, no." Marco tightened his grip around her waist, concern etched across his features. He whispered something in her ear, but she showed no recognition of his words or presence. Father Domingo, ever attuned to his congregation, noticed the disturbance but continued leading the prayer. His eyes met mine briefly, and I saw in them a flash of recognition, not surprise, but confirmation of something he'd been expecting. The overhead light flickered more violently now, the electrical disturbance impossible to ignore. Several people glanced upward nervously, but most remained focused on the prayer. When we finished, Father Domingo invited everyone to kneel for a moment of silent reflection before receiving communion. The chapel filled with the soft sounds of shifting bodies and creaking wood as people lowered themselves onto the kneelers. Elena remained standing. "Elena," Marco whispered, tugging gently at her hand. "Mi amor, estamos rezando." She didn't respond. Her gaze remained fixed on the monstrance, her breathing becoming more labored with each passing second. Then, without warning, she took a step forward, breaking the circle. "Elena," Sister Beatrice called quietly but firmly, "please return to your place." Elena took another step toward the center, then another. Her movements were strangely disjointed, as if her joints weren't quite working in coordination. It reminded me of a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. "Something's wrong," I whispered to Sister Beatrice. "Get Father Jimenez," she replied without taking her eyes off Elena. Father Jimenez was the senior priest who had been resting in his quarters after falling ill earlier that day. "Tell him to bring his kit." I knew immediately what she meant. Every diocese had priests trained in the rite of exorcism, though such interventions were exceedingly rare and performed only after extensive medical and psychological evaluation. Father Jimenez was one such priest. The kit contained the holy items used in such rituals: blessed water, consecrated oil, special prayers. But surely this wasn't that. Elena was having some kind of breakdown, perhaps triggered by the emotional intensity of the retreat. A panic attack, exhaustion, anything but what Sister Beatrice was implying. I hesitated, unwilling to escalate the situation to that level. "Now, Magdalena," Sister Beatrice hissed, her usual gentleness hardened by urgency. As I turned to leave, Elena spoke, but the voice that emerged wasn't hers. "She's not going anywhere," said a deep, raspy voice that seemed impossible to have originated from Elena's slight frame. The words were in Spanish, but with an accent I couldn't place, ancient somehow, like hearing a voice from a historical recording. The chapel fell silent. 30 pairs of eyes widened in shock. Marco stepped back involuntarily, his face draining of color. Elena's body began to tremble, subtle at first, then with increasing violence. Her head rolled back at an unnatural angle, revealing the strained tendons of her neck. "Marco," Father Domingo said calmly, though I could hear the controlled fear beneath his composure, "please step away from your wife." "I can't leave her," Marco protested, reaching for Elena's hand. "Do not touch her," Father Domingo said more forcefully. For your safety, step away." Reluctantly, Marco backed up several paces, his eyes never leaving his wife. Father Domingo approached Elena, slowly making the sign of the cross. "Elena, can you hear me?" he asked gently. A smile spread across Elena's face, not her warm, shy smile that had become familiar over the past days, but something cruel and knowing. Her eyes remained fixed on the monstrance. "Elena isn't available right now," the voice said louder this time so that everyone could hear clearly. "But I've been waiting for this invitation for a very long time." The overhead light exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging the chapel into semi-darkness. Several women screamed. The only remaining light came from our handheld candles and the votives around the perimeter. In this new, shadowy environment, Elena's face took on a grotesque quality. The candlelight from below cast harsh shadows that emphasized every line and contour, making her appear skull-like. "I'm going for Father Jimenez," I whispered to Sister Beatrice. As I moved toward the door, Elena's head swiveled toward me with impossible speed. "Running already, little Magdalena," the voice taunted. "You always were a coward." I froze. How did it know my name? And what did it mean by "always were"? We'd never met before this retreat. Elena, or whatever was speaking through her, laughed a sound like rocks grinding together. "You don't remember me, I remember you. I remember all God's little helpers." Father Domingo stepped between us, his hand raised in blessing. "In the name of Christ, I command you to be silent." Elena's body convulsed once violently as if struck by an invisible force. Then she became unnaturally still. The silence stretched for several seconds, broken only by the frightened breathing of the retreatants. "Get everyone out," Father Domingo said to Sister Beatrice without turning around. "Take them to the main hall and stay with them. Magdalena, get Father Jimenez, now!" This time I didn't hesitate. I backed toward the heavy wooden doors, unwilling to turn my back on Elena. As my hand found the iron handle, Elena lunged forward with inhuman speed toward the monstrance. 3 men, Marco and 2 others, reacted instinctively, moving to intercept her. They caught her mid-stride, restraining her arms, as she thrashed against them with surprising strength. One man, Luis, a former college football player with shoulders like boulders, was thrown backward as if he weighed nothing. He crashed into a pew, the wood splintering beneath the impact. The sound of Elena's laughter filled the chapel, echoing from the stone walls, and seeming to multiply into a chorus of mocking voices. I pulled the door open and slipped through, hearing it slam shut behind me with such force that the ancient hinges groaned in protest. The night air hit me like a blessing, cool and clean compared to the suffocating atmosphere inside. Stars glittered overhead, indifferent to the horror unfolding beneath them. I ran across the courtyard toward the residential wing where Father Jimenez would be resting. My footsteps echoed on the flagstones, unnaturally loud in the stillness. The rest of the hacienda was deserted. All other retreatants and staff were either in the chapel or had retired to their rooms. As I ran, a childhood prayer surfaced from memory. "Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil." My mother had taught me to recite it whenever I felt afraid of the dark. It had seemed like a quaint superstition then. Now the words felt like a lifeline. I reached Father Jimenez's quarters and pounded on the door without ceremony. "Father, come quickly. There's an emergency in the chapel." The door opened immediately, revealing the elderly priest fully dressed despite the late hour. His expression was grave but unsurprised, as if he'd been waiting for my arrival. "I heard the call," he said, simply reaching for a worn leather case on his desk. "I've been feeling it building since yesterday." "Feeling what, Father?" He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much in their 70 years. "Darkness is attracted to light, Magdalena. The more genuine healing happens here, the more it disturbs those who dwell in shadow. This retreat has been particularly blessed, 15 marriages finding their way back to love and faith. Did you think such transformation would go unchallenged?" A distant scream reached us from across the courtyard, high and desperate. "Elena! "We must hurry," Father Jimenez said, moving past me with surprising agility for his age. "What you're about to witness, child, it will challenge everything you understand about faith and evil. Remember, this fear is your enemy, not the entity in that chapel, fear itself." "What is happening to Elena?" I asked, struggling to keep pace with him. "Elena opened a door long ago," he replied. "Most likely unwittingly, and something has been waiting for the perfect moment to fully enter when her defenses were lowered, when she was in a place of absolute spiritual significance." "You mean during our most sacred ritual?" Father Jimenez nodded grimly. "The desecration of the sacred is its greatest delight." We reached the chapel doors, which now shuddered as if something inside was throwing itself against them. The wood ancient oak that had withstood centuries was splintering around the iron hinges. Father Jimenez placed his hand on the cracking surface, closed his eyes, and whispered a prayer in Latin. The violent shuddering subsided momentarily. "Listen to me carefully," he said, turning to face me. "What happens next is not a battle of physical strength, but of spiritual authority. No matter what you see or hear, remember that authentic faith is more powerful than any darkness." "Can you be strong, Magdalena? Can you stand witness without surrendering to terror?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to be the person he needed in this moment. But the truth pushed its way out. "I don't know, Father. I'm afraid." He smiled, then a gentle, understanding smile that seemed bizarrely out of place given the circumstances. "Of course you are. Only a fool wouldn't be. But courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it." He pressed his leather case into my hands. "You'll assist me. When I ask for something, you'll provide it without hesitation. Can you do that?" I nodded, finding my voice again. "Yes, Father, I can do that." "Then may God protect us both," he said, pushing open the chapel doors. The scene inside would forever alter my understanding of reality. The chapel had transformed in the brief time I'd been gone. The air inside hung thick and sulphurous, making each breath a conscious effort. Our votive candles, once arranged in perfect symmetry around the space, now flickered erratically despite the absence of any draft. Several had been extinguished entirely, leaving pools of hardened wax like small monuments to surrendered light. Elena was at the center of it all. 6 men, including Marco, struggled to restrain her as she thrashed with unnatural strength. Her body contorted in ways that defied normal human anatomy. Her spine arched backward at an impossible angle, her neck twisted as if attempting to rotate a full 360 degrees. The men's faces were slick with sweat, their expressions revealing the terrible strain of their efforts. Father Domingo stood a few feet away, desperately attempting to maintain order among the remaining retreatants who hadn't managed to evacuate. About 15 people remained frozen in a grotesque tableau of horror and fascination. Some prayed fervently, rosary beads clutched in white-knuckled hands. Others stood paralyzed, unable to process what they were witnessing. "The doors won't open," Sister Beatrice reported breathlessly, rushing toward us from the main entrance. "We can't get anyone else out." Father Jimenez nodded grimly, as if this was precisely what he had expected. "It wants witnesses," he said quietly, "and it wants to trap us here with it." The entity controlling Elena seemed to hear him despite the distance. Her head snapped in our direction, and a smile spread across her face that bore no resemblance to human joy. "The old exorcist arrives," she said, her voice layered with multiple tones, speaking simultaneously, some high and childlike, others deep and guttural. "We've been waiting for you, Father. How many years has it been, 2030? Time means nothing to us, but your body betrays how it has ravaged you." Father Jimenez showed no reaction to this taunt. He moved forward with measured steps, making the sign of the cross as he approached. "I come in the name of Christ," he declared, his voice carrying a strength that belied his age. Elena's laughter filled the chapel, bouncing off the stone walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Christ has abandoned this place. Can't you feel it? The emptiness, the void where your God should be? A woman near the back of the chapel began to sob, her cries punctuated by desperate prayers in Spanish. "Silence!" Father Domingo commanded, though whether to the woman or to the entity I wasn't certain. Father Jimenez opened his leather case and handed me his stole, the long, narrow cloth worn by priests during sacred rituals. "Place this around my neck," he instructed, bending slightly so I could reach. As I draped it over his shoulders, Elena's body went completely rigid. The men restraining her stumbled backward as she suddenly froze in place, standing unnaturally straight, her feet barely touching the ground. "You dare to prepare your rituals here," the voice thundered, no longer even attempting to sound like Elena. "In front of me!" The temperature in the chapel plummeted. My breath clouded in front of my face, and frost began to form on the stone floor around Elena's feet. Several of the remaining candles extinguished with audible hisses, plunging sections of the chapel into deeper darkness. "Father," I whispered, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the leather case. "What is happening to her?" "It's not just happening to her," he replied. "It's happening to this space, to all of us. The entity is trying to claim territory, physical and spiritual." He was right. I could feel something pressing against my consciousness, a heaviness, a despair that hadn't been there moments before. Intrusive thoughts flickered through my mind. "We can't win this. We're too small, too fragile. We should surrender." Father Jimenez must have sensed my faltering resolve. He gripped my shoulder firmly. "Those thoughts aren't yours, Magdalena. It's attacking your faith first because you're helping me. Push back." I nodded, swallowing hard against the fear rising in my throat. "What do you need from me now?" "Holy water," he said, "and stay close." I retrieved the small silver flask from his case and pressed it into his palm, our fingers touching briefly. His hands were ice-cold but steady. Father Jimenez approached Elena, who remained suspended in her unnatural posture. The men who had been restraining her hovered nearby, unsure whether to intervene. Marco's face was a mask of anguish as he watched his wife's body being used as a vessel for something so clearly malevolent. "Elena Delgado," Father Jimenez said calmly, "if you can hear me, fight. Remember who you are. Remember your baptism, your confirmation, your marriage before God. These are anchors that can help you find your way back." For a fleeting moment, something flickered across Elena's face, a flash of recognition, perhaps even a silent plea, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Elena is drowning in the dark," the voice replied. "She's been drowning for years, ever since she invited us in. Did you know that, priest? Did she confess her little experiment with the board when she was 12? The candles in the circle, the blood offering. Marco staggered backward as if physically struck. "What is it saying?" he demanded. "Elena would never—" "Oh, but she did," the voice continued, clearly delighting in the chaos it was creating. "Ask her about the summer at her grandmother's house. Ask her about the old books in the attic. Ask her about the promise she made to conceive a child." "Enough," Father Jimenez commanded, unscrewing the flask of holy water. "You are a deceiver and the father of lies." Elena's body began to shake violently, her teeth chattering as if from extreme cold. "Truth hurts more than lies, priest. You should know that better than anyone." Father Jimenez flicked holy water toward Elena in a swift, practiced motion. The droplets sizzled audibly when they contacted her skin, raising angry red welts like acid burns. Elena's scream was not human, a high, piercing shriek that shattered 2 stained glass windows on the western wall. Glass fragments rained down narrowly, missing several retreatants who crowded against the opposite wall. Sister Beatrice rushed to check on them, while Father Domingo continued trying to usher people toward the main doors, which remained stubbornly sealed despite his efforts. "The exits are blocked," he reported, returning to Father Jimenez's side. "It's as if the wood has fused together." Father Jimenez nodded grimly. "We must proceed here, then. All of you," he addressed the room. "Stay back against the walls. Whatever you do, maintain your prayers. Your faith is a shield, not just for yourselves, but for Elena." I noticed that several retreatants had blood trickling from their ears, the aftermath of Elena's inhuman scream. One man had collapsed into a pew, clutching his chest as his wife frantically tried to help him. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Father Jimenez turned to me. "The ritual book Magdalena, the black one with the red cross." I found it in his case, an ancient leather-bound volume with weathered pages and Latin text. As I handed it to him, Elena's gaze fixed on the book with naked hatred. "That won't save her," the voice growled. "Nothing can save her now." Father Jimenez opened the book to a marked page and began to read. "Exorcizamus te omnes immundus spiritus omnes satanica potestas." Before he could continue, Elena's body dropped to the floor with bone-crushing force. She began to crawl toward us, not on hands and knees, but in a horrifying spider-like movement, her limbs bent at unnatural angles, her head twisted to maintain eye contact. "Stop her," Father Jimenez commanded. Marco and two other men rushed forward, attempting to restrain her again, but Elena moved with inhuman speed. She seized one man's ankle, her fingers digging in with such force that blood immediately seeped through his pant leg. He screamed in agony as something cracked audibly, the sound of bones splintering beneath her grip. The chapel's main crucifix, a wooden figure of Christ that had hung above the altar for generations, suddenly detached from the wall and crashed to the floor, the corpus breaking into pieces as if deliberately destroyed. "It's desecrating everything sacred," Father Domingo gasped, crossing himself repeatedly. Father Jimenez continued reading from the ritual book, his voice growing stronger with each line of Latin. Elena released her victim and writhed on the floor, her body twisting in ways that threatened to snap her spine. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and dark veins protruded visibly across her face and neck. "The crucifix from my case," Father Jimenez instructed me without pausing his recitation. I retrieved a simple silver crucifix about 6 inches in length. Unlike the ornate crucifixes common in Mexican Catholicism, this one was stark and unadorned, a symbol reduced to its most essential form. The moment I touched it, Elena's attention snapped to me. She ceased her writhing and became perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the crucifix in my hand. "The helper thinks she can save them," she said, her voice now a childish sing-song that was somehow more terrifying than the previous growl. "Sweet Magdalena with her perfect faith, shall we show them all what you did when you were 16? Shall we tell them about the baby?" Ice flooded my veins. How could it possibly know about that I had never spoken of it to anyone, not my family, not my church, not even in confession? It was my darkest secret, buried so deeply I had convinced myself it wasn't real. Father Jimenez didn't falter in his recitation, but his eyes flicked briefly toward me, registering the impact of the entity's words. "Don't listen," he managed between Latin verses. "It mines memories, twists truths. Focus, Magdalena." But Elena, or the thing inside her, wasn't finished with me. "You pray so prettily now, organizing your little retreats, playing the perfect Catholic girl. But God knows what you did. He sees the blood on your hands. You think redemption is possible for someone like you?" My hands began to shake so violently that I nearly dropped the crucifix. Shame and long-buried grief threatened to overwhelm me. For a moment I was 16 again, alone, terrified, making the decision that had haunted me ever since. Sister Beatrice appeared at my side, her weathered hand closing over mine to steady the crucifix. "Look at me, child," she commanded. Not at her. At me. I forced myself to meet Sister Beatrice's calm gaze. In her eyes I saw not judgment but understanding, as if she could see straight through to the wounded girl I had once been. "Your past is between you and God," she said firmly. "This thing has no right to it. Give Father Jimenez the crucifix and stand your ground." Somehow her simple words cut through the paralyzing shame. I straightened my back and stepped forward, extending the crucifix toward Father Jimenez. Elena screamed again, that same unholy sound, but this time I was prepared, pressing my free hand against one ear while maintaining my grip on the sacred object. Father Jimenez took the crucifix and held it toward Elena. "By the power of Christ's sacrifice, I command you reveal your name." The entity's response was to propel Elena's body several feet into the air before slamming her back to the ground with sickening force. Any normal human would have suffered broken bones, yet Elena rose again, her movements jerky but determined. Blood ran freely from her nose and ears, yet her face showed no evidence of pain. "Names have power, priest," the voice snarled. "You won't trick me so easily." "Then I will call you what you are," Father Jimenez replied. "Unclean spirit, deceiver, ancient enemy of mankind." Elena's laughter returned, that terrible multi-layered sound that seemed to come from multiple throats simultaneously. "Such dramatic titles. We are older than your church, older than your Christ. We watched humans crawl from the mud. We'll watch them return to it." During this exchange, I noticed Marco edging closer to his wife, his expression a complex mixture of terror and determination. Before anyone could stop him, he lunged forward and grabbed Elena's shoulders. "Elena, mi amor, fight this thing, come back to me." The entity reacted with explosive violence. Elena's arm shot out, catching Marco across the chest with such force that he was thrown backward into the altar. His head struck the corner with a sickening crack, and he slumped to the floor, a pool of blood quickly forming beneath him. "Marco!" I screamed, rushing toward him without thinking. Father Domingo reached him first, pressing his stole against the wound to staunch the bleeding. "He's alive," he reported, though his tone suggested Marco's condition was serious. Elena watched this scene unfold with an expression of perverse satisfaction. "One down," she said coldly. "Who's next? The old nun, the young helper, or perhaps you Father Exorcist? Your heart isn't what it used to be, is it? I can hear it struggling in your chest. Thump, thump, thump." She mimicked a heartbeat, gradually slowing the rhythm, as if demonstrating what she intended to happen to Father Jimenez. The priest ignored the taunt, continuing his ritual without hesitation. He raised the crucifix higher and approached Elena with measured steps. Through the mysteries of the incarnation, passion, death, resurrection, and ascension of our Lord Jesus Christ, through the coming of the Holy Spirit, through the coming of our Lord for judgment, I command you, tell me when you entered this woman. Something in the precise wording of this command seemed to affect the entity differently than previous attempts. Elena's body seized, as if experiencing an electric shock. When she spoke again, the voice was strained, as if the words were being forcibly extracted. "The board, first contact through the board, but not fully, not then." Father Jimenez pressed his advantage. "When did you fully enter her?" Elena's face contorted in what appeared to be a battle for control. Her eyes rolled back, then forward again, changing from their natural brown to a milky white, then back again, as if two consciousnesses were fighting for the same space. "The ritual, in the basement, 3 months ago. Blood sacrifice, desperate for a child." Marco moaned from his position on the floor, perhaps registering these revelations even in his injured state. Father Jimenez's expression remained impassive, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was gathering information ammunition for the battle to come. "How many are you?" he demanded. Elena's body began to convulse, her head shaking violently from side to side. "Many, we are many." "Give me your names." "Legion!" She shrieked the single word, echoing throughout the chapel with such force that dust and small fragments of plaster rained down from the ceiling. Father Jimenez turned slightly toward me, keeping Elena in his peripheral vision. "The oil!" he instructed. "Quickly!" I retrieved a small vial of blessed oil from his case and handed it to him. As I did, I noticed something alarming. The wounds on Elena's face were healing. The blood from her nose and ears had stopped flowing, and the bruises from her violent impact with the floor were fading visibly, like a time lapse of normal healing compressed into seconds. Father Jimenez saw it too. "It's strengthening its hold," he muttered. "We must act quickly." He uncapped the oil and began to approach Elena again, but she was prepared this time. With a swift, vicious movement, she grabbed the nearest retreatant, a middle-aged woman who had been praying quietly near the wall, and pulled her close, using her as a human shield. "Come closer, priest," the entity taunted through Elena's lips, "and I'll snap her neck before you can blink." The woman whimpered in terror, her rosary beads slipping from her fingers and clattering to the floor. Elena's grip on her throat was visibly tightening the woman's face, reddening as her airway constricted. Father Jimenez hesitated, clearly unwilling to risk the retreatant's life. In that moment of uncertainty, the entity pressed its advantage. "Put down your pathetic tools," it commanded. "Kneel before me, old man, and perhaps I'll be merciful." The chapel doors suddenly rattled violently as if struck by hurricane-force winds. The temperature dropped further frost, now creeping up the walls in intricate, unnatural patterns. The few remaining candles extinguished simultaneously, leaving only the emergency lights casting harsh shadows across the scene. Sister Beatrice began to pray loudly, leading the remaining retreatants in a desperate rosary. Their voices, initially tremulous, gradually strengthened as more joined in creating a current of sound that seemed to push back against the oppressive atmosphere. The entity reacted with rage, causing Elena to release her hostage and clutch at her own ears. "Silence," she commanded, but the prayers continued, growing louder. Father Jimenez seized the opportunity, lunging forward with unexpected agility and pressing the crucifix against Elena's forehead. "By the power of Christ's blood, I bind you." Elena's scream transcended anything I'd heard before, pure agony and fury combined. Where the silver touched her skin, steam rose, as if from a hot brand on ice. She thrashed violently, nearly dislodging Father Jimenez, but he maintained contact through sheer determination. "The book," he shouted to me over Elena's continued screams. "Read page 47, the prayer of binding." I fumbled with the ritual book, finding the page with shaking hands. The Latin text swam before my eyes. My seminary training had included some Latin, but never for this purpose. Nevertheless, I began to read, stumbling over the ancient words, but pushing forward with growing confidence as I continued. "Audi nos Domine Sancte Pater Omnipotens Aeterne Deus." As I read, Father Jimenez continued to press the crucifix against Elena while reciting his own prayers. Elena's body bucked and writhed beneath his grip, but he held firm, his elderly frame somehow containing strength beyond its years. The entity, realizing it was temporarily cornered, changed tactics. Elena's body suddenly went limp, collapsing to the floor like a marionette with cut strings. Father Jimenez maintained his hold, kneeling beside her. For a moment the chapel was eerily quiet, save for the murmured prayers of the retreatants and Marco's pained breathing from where he lay injured. Then Elena's eyes snapped open, but they were her eyes again, brown and clear and filled with terror. "Help me," she whispered, her voice entirely her own. "Please, it's hurting me. It won't let me go." Father Jimenez didn't relax his guard, but his expression softened slightly. "Elena, can you hear me?" "Yes." She whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know what I was doing. The ritual, I just wanted a baby so badly. Marco was going to leave me." Her gaze darted to where her husband lay unconscious. "Oh God, Marco! What happened to him? Did it?" "He's alive," Father Jimenez assured her. "Focus on my voice, Elena. You must fight this presence. Renounce it." She nodded desperately. "I renounce it. I want it gone. Please help me, Father." Father Jimenez motioned for me to approach with the oil. I did so cautiously, still unsure whether this was truly Elena or another deception. "I'm going to anoint you," Father Jimenez explained to Elena. "It may cause pain if the entity resists, but it will help strengthen your resistance." Elena nodded again, her body trembling. "Do it, please." Father Jimenez dipped his thumb in the blessed oil and made the sign of the cross on Elena's forehead. "In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti." For a moment, nothing happened. Elena closed her eyes, her breathing steadying slightly. Then, without warning, her expression contorted into a mask of hatred. Her hand shot up, seizing Father Jimenez's wrist with crushing force. "Fool!" The entity's voice returned deeper and more confident than before. "Did you think it would be so easy?" With supernatural strength, Elena flung Father Jimenez across the chapel. His frail body hit the wall with a sickening impact, and he crumpled to the floor, momentarily stunned. The ritual book fell from my hands as Elena turned her attention to me. Her face was transforming again, veins darkening beneath her skin, eyes clouding to that milky white. "Alone at last, little Magdalena," she said, rising to her feet with fluid grace. "No priests to hide behind now." I backed away, groping blindly for anything that might serve as protection. My hand closed around the fallen crucifix, and I held it before me like a shield. Elena's laughter returned, that horrible, multi-layered sound. "You think that trinket will protect you? You whose hands are stained with innocent blood!" The shame returned in a crushing wave, but this time I pushed back against it. "That's between me and God," I said, echoing Sister Beatrice's words. "You have no power over it." Elena tilted her head, a predatory gesture that reminded me more of a reptile than a human. Such bravery from someone so small. Let's see how long it lasts. She took a step toward me, and I felt something fundamental shift in the atmosphere of the chapel, as if reality itself was bending around her. The emergency lights flickered and died, plunging us into near-total darkness. The only illumination came from Elena herself, a faint, sickly glow emanating from her skin. In that moment, with Father Jimenez incapacitated and darkness pressing in, I realized with terrifying clarity that we had dramatically underestimated what we were facing. This wasn't just a spiritual battle, it was a war, and we were losing. In the near-total darkness, the only reliable sense remaining to me was sound. Elena's irregular breathing, the soft moans of the injured, fervent whispers of prayer from the huddled retreatants. The scent of beeswax and incense that had once sanctified this space was now overwhelmed by a putrid stench like rotting meat mixed with sulfur. I clutched the crucifix so tightly that its edges cut into my palm. My blood trickled down my wrist, but I barely registered the pain. In that moment, standing alone against whatever inhabited Elena's body, I understood with perfect clarity that I was utterly unprepared for what we faced. Magdalena. The voice wasn't Elena's anymore. It had transformed into something ancient and terrible, like stones grinding together beneath the earth. "Put down that pathetic symbol and I'll let you live. Fight me and I'll wear your skin next." I could see her silhouette in the darkness, illuminated by that sickly phosphorescence emanating from her skin. The entity wasn't bothering to maintain human posture anymore. Elena's body stood at impossible angles, joints bent backward, head rotated too far, fingers elongated into claw-like appendages. "Our Father who art in heaven," I began reciting, my voice barely above a whisper. "Silence!" The thing in Elena roared, the sound physically painful to my ears. "Hallowed be thy name!" I continued, forcing each word past the terror constricting my throat. Elena's body skittered forward, not walking, but moving in rapid, jerking motions like a monstrous insect. I backed away until I felt the cold stone wall behind me. There was nowhere left to run. "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." A hand clamped around my throat with crushing force, inhuman strength in those elongated fingers. Elena's face was inches from mine, so close I could see that her eyes weren't just clouded white anymore. They were fracturing like cracked glass, revealing something else looking out through the fissures. "You think your God can hear you in here?" The voices taunted, hot breath against my face, smelling of decay. "This is our domain now. We claimed it the moment we spilled sacred blood on sacred ground." The pressure on my throat increased. Dark spots bloomed in my vision as oxygen deprivation set in. The crucifix slipped from my grasp, clattering to the stone floor. This is how I die, I thought with strange clarity. Not old in my bed, but here in this chapel at the hands of something mankind was never meant to comprehend. Then a voice pierced the darkness, not loud, but carrying an authority that cut through the chaos like a blade. Ecce crucium Domini. Father Jimenez had regained consciousness and was leaning heavily against the altar, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. Fugit partes adversae. Behold the cross of the Lord, flee adversaries. The entity flinched as if struck, loosening its grip on my throat just enough for me to gasp a precious breath. Father Jimenez was holding something aloft, a small reliquary I recognized from his kit containing what he had once told me was a splinter of the true cross. Vixit Leo de tribu Juda radix David, he continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. The entity shrieked a sound that cracked the remaining stained glass windows and sent shards raining down on the huddled retreatants. Sister Beatrice moved quickly, shielding as many as she could with her own body. Elena's form contorted again, limbs twisting at angles that should have shattered bone. "That toy won't save you, priest," the voices snarled, though I could hear uncertainty beneath the bravado. "Your faith is weak. Your church is dying. You are the last of a fading breed." "I may be," Father Jimenez acknowledged, taking an unsteady step forward, "but he whom I serve is eternal, and it is not by my authority that I command you, but by his." He raised the reliquary higher, and to my astonishment it began to emit light, not the harsh glare of electric bulbs or the warm flicker of flame, but a steady silver-white radiance that pushed back the darkness without seeming to cast shadows. The entity reacted violently, forcing Elena's body to retreat. It knocked over candelabras and prayer benches, creating barriers between itself and Father Jimenez. "Sister Beatrice," Father Jimenez called without taking his eyes off Elena. "Get everyone against the west wall. Magdalena, the ritual book. Now." I scrambled to retrieve the fallen book, moving in a crouch to present as small a target as possible. As I passed Marco's unconscious form, I noticed Father Domingo had managed to stop the bleeding from his head wound and was now attempting to drag him toward the relative safety of the west wall. "Let me help," I whispered, taking Marco's feet while Father Domingo supported his shoulders. Together we moved him to join the other retreatants who had formed a tight cluster under Sister Beatrice's direction. They had linked hands and were praying in unison, a rhythmic Spanish litany that seemed to create a buffer against the chaotic energy emanating from Elena. "How is he?" I asked Father Domingo once we had positioned Marco as comfortably as possible. "Alive, but he needs a hospital," he replied grimly. "The skull is fractured." I glanced at Elena, or what had once been Elena. In the light from Father Jimenez's reliquary, I could see that her transformation was progressing. Her skin had taken on a grayish, almost reptilian texture. The veins beneath pulsed with black ichor rather than red blood. Her mouth had extended slightly, teeth visibly sharpening within. "What is happening to her?" I whispered. "The possession is becoming physical," Father Domingo explained, his voice tight with controlled fear. "It's rare, but in cases of prolonged infestation, particularly when invited through ritual, the body begins to adapt to house the entity more efficiently." "Can she survive that?" His silence was answer enough. I returned to Father Jimenez with the ritual book, careful to stay within the protective radius of light emanating from the reliquary. The entity watched our movements with predatory focus. Elena's transformed body crouched atop the altar itself, a deliberate desecration. "Find the adjuration against the seven," Father Jimenez instructed, never breaking eye contact with the entity. "Page 63. I flipped through the ancient pages, finding the indicated text. It was longer than the previous prayers, a complex Latin exorcism specifically targeting multiple demonic presences. "You said, Legion, Father Jimenez addressed the entity directly. An old trick hiding your number to increase your perceived strength. But I know what you are, fragmentary spirits, lesser demons clustered together like scavengers. Alone, each of you is nothing. Together you're still less than you pretend to be." This strategic belittlement had an immediate effect. Elena's body reacted with unbridled fury, launching itself from the altar toward Father Jimenez with inhuman speed. But as it entered the full light of the reliquary, something extraordinary happened. The entity screamed not in rage, but in genuine pain. Where the light touched Elena's transformed skin, it sizzled audibly, releasing thin tendrils of acrid smoke. The entity retreated, circling the perimeter of the chapel where shadows still held sway. "It's vulnerable to the relic," I breathed, understanding dawning. Father Jimenez nodded slightly. "Begin reading," he instructed. "I'll attempt to contain it within the light." I started the adjuration, the Latin flowing more easily now, as if the words themselves wanted to be spoken. Father Jimenez moved slowly, strategically, using the reliquary's light to gradually reduce the entity's territory. "In nomine Domini nostri Jesu Christi eradicar et effugare." The entity howled its displeasure, causing objects throughout the chapel to vibrate and levitate, prayer books, candelabras, shards of broken glass, all rising into the air and orbiting the room in chaotic patterns. "It's trying to distract us," Father Jimenez warned. "Focus on the words, nothing else." I continued reading, but it became increasingly difficult as the entity escalated its assault. The orbiting objects began launching themselves at us like projectiles. A heavy brass candlestick struck my shoulder with bruising force. A shard of stained glass sliced across Father Jimenez's cheek, opening a thin red line that immediately began to bleed. Still, we pressed on. Father Jimenez maneuvered us closer to the huddled retreatants, extending the reliquary's protection over them. The entity, realizing its tactics weren't working, changed strategy again. Elena's body suddenly went rigid, her back arching impossibly far as her mouth opened wider than humanly possible. From that gaping maw emerged a sound I can only describe as the concentrated essence of suffering, as if every scream of pain, every cry of despair, every whimper of fear throughout human history had been distilled into a single sustained note. Several retreatants collapsed, blood streaming from their ears. Others pressed their hands against their heads, faces contorted in agony. Even Father Jimenez staggered momentarily, lowering the reliquary. In that instant of weakness, the entity struck. With lightning speed, it propelled Elena's body across the chapel, crashing into Father Jimenez with such force that both went down. The reliquary flew from his grasp, skittering across the stone floor and coming to rest near the fallen crucifix. The chapel plunged back into darkness as the light was extinguished. "Father!" I cried, abandoning the ritual book to rush toward where I'd last seen him. My eyes hadn't adjusted to the sudden darkness, but my outstretched hands found fabric, the rough texture of a priest's cassock. I grabbed it, trying to help Father Jimenez to his feet. "Magdalena," came a whisper that raised the hairs on my neck. It was Father Jimenez's voice, but wrong, somehow hollow, as if spoken from the bottom of a well. "The reliquary. Bring it to me." Something deep within me, instinct, divine guidance, or perhaps just heightened survival instinct, screamed a warning. I released the fabric and stumbled backward. "You're not Father Jimenez," I said, my voice trembling. Laughter erupted from the darkness, that same multi-layered sound I'd come to dread. "Clever girl," the entity purred, "but not clever enough." A match flared to life across the chapel, illuminating Sister Beatrice's weathered face as she lit one of the few remaining candles. In its weak glow, I could see the truth of our situation. Father Jimenez lay crumpled against the altar steps, blood pooling beneath his head. The figure I'd nearly handed the reliquary to was Elena, or what remained of her. The transformation had progressed further, her face now an unsettling hybrid of human and something else, her fingers elongated into talons, her posture bent and predatory. "The old priest is dying," the entity announced with cruel satisfaction. "His heart finally gave out. How tragic." "No," I whispered, looking toward Father Jimenez's still form. "Yes," the entity hissed, "and you'll be next. All of you will be next." This sacred ground will become a monument to despair. We'll use your bodies until they rot, then preserve them as warnings to others who dare to challenge us." The candle Sister Beatrice had lit suddenly flared impossibly bright, illuminating the chapel more fully than it should have been able to. In that expanded light, I could see Father Jimenez's chest rising and falling shallowly. He was alive, but barely. "He's alive," I called out, hoping to bolster the retreatant's faltering courage. The entity snarled, lunging toward Sister Beatrice to extinguish the unnatural light. But before it could reach her, something remarkable happened. Father Domingo stepped forward, placing himself between the entity and Sister Beatrice. In his hand was the church's aspergillum, the silver implement used to sprinkle holy water during blessings. Where he had found it in the chaos I couldn't guess, but he wielded it now with the confidence of a warrior raising a sword. "In the name of Christ, I command you to halt," he declared, his voice carrying an authority I'd never heard from him before. The entity hesitated, momentarily confused by this new resistance. Father Domingo took advantage of the hesitation, flinging holy water in a wide arc that caught the entity squarely in what had once been Elena's face. The reaction was instantaneous and horrifying. The skin bubbled and smoked where the water touched, revealing glimpses of something beneath, something black and chitinous that had no place within a human body. The entity shrieked, clawing at its face with those elongated fingers, inadvertently causing more damage to its vessel. Elena's physical form was deteriorating rapidly now, the human shell no longer able to contain what dwelled within. "The reliquary," Father Domingo shouted to me, "and the crucifix, bring them." I spotted both items near the fallen altar and scrambled toward them, my heart pounding so violently I could feel it in my throat. The entity, momentarily distracted by its own pain, didn't notice my movement until I had already secured both sacred objects. "No!" it roared, abandoning Father Domingo to lunge toward me. I raised the crucifix instinctively, and the entity recoiled as if struck. The simple silver cross seemed to burn with its own inner light now, and I felt a strange power flowing through it into my arm, steadying my trembling hand. "The book," I called to Father Domingo. "We need to continue the ritual." He nodded, spotting the fallen tome and retrieving it while maintaining his defensive position. The entity circled us warily now, no longer attacking directly but searching for weakness in our defense. "You can't maintain this forever," it taunted. "The girl tires, the old nun weakens, the priest is dying, the husband is unconscious. And this one," it gestured toward Father Domingo, "lacks the authority for a true exorcism." "Perhaps," Father Domingo acknowledged calmly, "but we don't need forever. We only need long enough." He began to read from the ritual book, continuing the adjuration from where I had left off. His pronunciation wasn't as precise as Father Jimenez's, but what he lacked in technical perfection he made up for in conviction. As he read, I moved carefully toward Father Jimenez, keeping the crucifix extended before me as a shield. When I reached him, I knelt beside his prone form, feeling for a pulse. It was there, weak and irregular, but present. "Father," I whispered urgently. "Father Jimenez, please, we need you." His eyelids fluttered but didn't open. His breathing had become more labored, each inhalation a visible struggle. Whatever internal damage the entity had inflicted, it was severe. I placed the reliquary in his limp hand, closing his fingers around it. "Please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "I can't do this alone." The entity had begun another assault, this time focusing on Father Domingo. It circled him, rapidly moving with that unnatural spider-like gait, occasionally darting forward to slash at him with its talons before retreating. Each attack left Father Domingo more bloodied, his cassock becoming shredded with long, vicious tears. Yet he continued reading, his voice never faltering despite the pain he must have been experiencing. Sister Beatrice had joined him now, supporting him physically while adding her own prayers to the ritual. The retreatants, seeing this example of courage, had begun to recover their own determination. They formed a tighter circle, their prayers growing in volume and conviction. The collective faith in that room was becoming a palpable force. something I could almost see as a faint luminescence surrounding each person. The entity sensed this shift. Its attacks became more frenzied, but less coordinated, more desperate than strategic. Elena's body was moving in increasingly erratic patterns, sometimes seeming to fight against its own actions. "She's fighting back," I realized aloud. "Elena is fighting from within." This realization gave me renewed hope. I turned back to Father Jimenez, squeezing his hand that held the reliquary. "Elena is still in there," I told him, unsure if he could hear me. "She's fighting. We need to help her." To my astonishment, Father Jimenez's eyes opened, clouded with pain but alert. "The final binding," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "It requires her true name, her baptismal name." "Marco would know," I said, glancing toward where Elena's husband still lay unconscious. Father Jimenez shook his head slightly, wincing at the movement. "No time! Must deduce it!" I thought frantically. Elena Delgado was likely not her full baptismal name. In Mexican Catholic tradition, many girls were named Maria, something with Maria often omitted in daily use. "Maria Elena," I guessed. Father Jimenez's expression remained uncertain. "Elena Maria," I tried again. Still nothing. The entity had noticed our whispered conversation and was now trying to break through the protective circle of retreatants to reach us. Father Domingo and Sister Beatrice moved to intercept, still reading from the ritual book while flinging holy water to keep the entity at bay. I closed my eyes, trying to remember anything that might help. During the retreat registration, I had handled the paperwork for all participants. Elena's forms might have contained her full name. "Maria Elena Catalina," I said suddenly, the memory surfacing from days earlier. That was it. Maria Elena Catalina Delgado Rivera. Father Jimenez's eyes lit with recognition. "Yes," he breathed. "Help me up." I supported his frail body as he struggled to a sitting position, pain etched in every line of his face. Blood soaked the back of his cassock where his head had struck the floor. How he remained conscious was beyond my comprehension. "The final binding," he instructed, "requires 3 voices in union: you, me, and her husband." I looked over at Marco's unconscious form. "But he's—" "Wake him," Father Jimenez interrupted. "Whatever it takes." I hesitated, torn between staying with Father Jimenez and following his instructions. He made the decision for me, pushing me weakly toward Marco. "Go, I'll prepare. There's very little time left." I crossed the chapel as quickly as I dared, keeping the crucifix raised against potential attacks. When I reached Marco, I knelt beside him, assessing his condition. Father Domingo had bound his head wound with strips torn from his own alb, but blood had soaked through the makeshift bandages. His breathing was shallow but steady. "Marco," I called, gently shaking his shoulder. "Marco, wake up. Elena needs you." No response. "Marco," I said more forcefully, lightly tapping his cheek. "Your wife needs you." His eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Behind me, I could hear the entity's attacks intensifying. Father Domingo cried out in pain as talons raked across his chest. Sister Beatrice stumbled, nearly dropping her candle. The retreatant circle was breaking their unified prayers, fragmenting into individual cries of fear. We were losing ground rapidly. In desperation, I leaned close to Marco's ear and whispered, "Your baby needs you." His eyes snapped open, unfocused at first, then sharpening with alarming speed. "Baby," he mumbled, trying to sit up. "Easy," I cautioned, supporting him. "You're injured." He winced, raising a hand to his bandaged head. "Elena? Where's Elena?" I helped him turn carefully until he could see what remained of his wife. The entity had abandoned any pretense of humanity now. Elena's form had transformed horrifically, limbs elongated and bent at unnatural angles. Skin split in places to reveal that chitinous black substance beneath face stretched into something barely recognizable as human. Marco made a choked sound of despair. "Dios mío, what is happening to her?" "She performed a ritual," I explained quickly. "Something to help conceive a child. But it opened a door to this." Father Jimenez believes we can save her, but we need your help." His eyes never left Elena's transformed figure as he nodded. "Anything. Tell me what to do." I helped him to his feet, steadying him as he swayed with vertigo. Together we made our way back to Father Jimenez, who had somehow managed to stand leaning heavily against the altar for support. The reliquary in his hand glowed with renewed intensity, pushing back the shadows that had begun to engulf the chapel. The entity noticed our movement and abandoned its attack on Father Domingo, turning its full attention to us. "The husband awakens," it mocked. "Come to witness your wife's final moments. She surrendered her body willingly, you know. All for the promise of a child she'll never have." Marco's face hardened with determination. "That thing is not my wife," he said firmly. "My wife is still in there fighting, and I'm going to help her." "Touching," the entity sneered, "but futile." It lunged toward us, moving with that horrifying spider-like gait. Before it could reach us, Father Jimenez raised the reliquary higher, its light intensifying until the entity shrieked and recoiled. "Quickly!" Father Jimenez gasped clearly, struggling to maintain his strength. "The final binding must be performed while the entity is weakened. Marco, take this book. Read the highlighted section when I give the signal." He handed Marco the ritual book, open to a page marked with a red ribbon. Marco took it, scanning the Latin text with uncertain eyes. "I don't know Latin," he admitted. "You don't need to understand it," Father Jimenez assured him. "You only need to speak it with conviction. Your love for Elena will guide your tongue." Father Jimenez positioned us in a triangle, himself at the point closest to the entity, Marco and me flanking him. He raised the reliquary in one hand, and the aspergillum in the other, its silver basin now refilled with holy water. "When I say, 'Now we begin,'" he instructed. "Magdalena, you will invoke Elena's baptismal name at each pause. Marco, you will read the binding prayer. I will perform the sealing. Together we will free her from this abomination." The entity, sensing what was about to happen, launched a desperate final assault. It rose to its full height, Elena's body now stretched and distorted beyond recognition, and opened its mouth impossibly wide. From that gaping maw emerged not a scream, but something far worse, a swarm of shadowy winged forms that filled the air like living smoke. "Locusts," Father Jimenez identified them grimly. "A manifestation of its desperation. Do not let them touch you." The swarm circled the chapel, creating a living barrier between us and the entity. Wherever they touched stone or wood, they left scorched marks like tiny burns. One brushed against a retreatant's arm, raising an immediate welt that oozed clear fluid. "Now," Father Jimenez commanded, raising the reliquary high. A beam of pure white light shot from the sacred object, piercing the swarm and creating a pathway to the entity itself. The locust manifestations shrieked in unison, their tiny bodies combusting wherever the light touched them. "Maria Elena Catalina," I shouted through the chaos. Marco began reading the Latin binding prayer, his pronunciation awkward, but his voice strong and determined. "Te exorciso spiritus immunde in nomine Domini nostri Jesu Christi." Father Jimenez raised the aspergillum and flung holy water in a wide arc, creating a glistening barrier that the remaining locusts couldn't penetrate. "Exi ergo transgressor, exi seductor plene omni dolo et fallacia." The entity thrashed violently, Elena's body contorting in ways that should have broken every bone. The swarm of locusts began to dissipate, some burning away in the reliquary's light, others seeming to be sucked back into the entity itself. "Maria Elena Catalina," I called again as the prayer reached its first pause. Marco continued reading, his voice growing stronger with each line. Father Jimenez maintained the beam of light from the reliquary, though I could see his arm trembling with the effort. The chapel began to vibrate, stone dust raining from the ceiling. The few remaining windows shattered simultaneously, glass shards flying inward only to stop in mid-air as if caught in an invisible net. "It's fighting the binding," Father Jimenez warned. "We must be stronger, louder, more unified." "Maria Elena Catalina," I shouted at the next pause, putting every ounce of my being into the name. Marco's voice rose to match mine, the Latin flowing more naturally now, as if the language itself was guiding him. Father Jimenez joined us, creating a triumvirate of sound that seemed to physically push against the entity. Elena's body began to change again, not further into monstrosity, but back toward humanity. The elongated limbs contracted. The chitinous black substance receded beneath closing fissures in her skin. Her face, while still distorted, became more recognizable. "It's working!" I cried out. "Do not break the rhythm," Father Jimenez cautioned. "We are not finished." We continued the ritual, each repetition of Elena's baptismal name seeming to anchor her more firmly to her true self. The entity fought viciously, causing objects around the chapel to explode, chalices, candles, even the stone baptismal font cracking down the middle. Yet with each assault our determination only strengthened. The retreatants had regained their courage and joined their voices to ours, creating a wall of sound that seemed to compress the space around the entity. The final invocation Father Jimenez announced as we neared the end of the ritual. "All together now. Maria Elena Catalina Delgado Rivera," we called in unison, "in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti revertere ad formam quam Deus creavit." Return to the form God created. The entity released a scream that transcended sound, a vibration that shook the very foundations of the chapel. The remaining glass shards suspended in the air burst into dust. The stone floor beneath Elena cracked in a perfect circle. Then abruptly silence fell. Elena collapsed to the floor, her body entirely human once more. No movement, no breath, no sign of life. Marco broke from our triangle, rushing to his wife's side with a cry of anguish. "Elena, Elena, por favor, despierta!" Father Jimenez sagged against me, the reliquary's light finally dimming as his strength gave out. I helped lower him gently to the floor, alarmed by the gray pallor of his skin and the erratic rhythm of his breathing. "Is it over?" I asked him quietly. He nodded weakly. "The binding is complete, the entity vanished. And Elena—" He turned his gaze toward where Marco cradled his wife's still form, tears streaming down his face as he rocked her gently. "That depends on how much of her remained to save," Father Jimenez whispered. As if in answer to his words, Elena suddenly gasped, a desperate, hungry inhalation like a drowning person breaking the surface. Her eyes flew open, darting around in confusion and terror until they landed on Marco's face. "Mi amor," she whispered, her voice raw, but entirely her own. "Que pasó? Where am I?" Marco sobbed with relief, gathering her closer. "You're back. You're back. Gracias a Dios, you're back." Father Domingo and Sister Beatrice approached cautiously, still wary despite the apparent success of the binding ritual. Father Domingo carried a small vial of holy water which he sprinkled gently over Elena. No reaction, no smoke, no pain, just ordinary blessed water on ordinary human skin. "It's gone," Sister Beatrice confirmed, making the sign of the cross. "Praise be to God." The retreatants began to stir from their huddled positions, some weeping with relief, others still too shocked to fully process what they had witnessed. Father Domingo immediately began organizing them, assigning the less traumatized to help the injured. I remained beside Father Jimenez, whose condition was deteriorating rapidly. His breathing had become shallow and labored, his pulse threading beneath my fingers as I checked his wrist. "Father," I said urgently, "we need to get you to a hospital." He shook his head slightly. "Too late for that, my child. This old heart has given all it can." "No," I protested, tears burning my eyes. "You can't die, not after everything we've just survived." A small, peaceful smile touched his lips. "This isn't defeat, Magdalena. This is completion." Elena appeared at my side, supported by Marco. Though pale and weak, her eyes were clear and focused. She knelt beside Father Jimenez, taking his hand in hers. "You saved me," she said simply. "I don't remember everything, but I know you pulled me back from somewhere terrible." Father Jimenez squeezed her hand weakly. "Not me, your husband, your faith, your true name." She looked confused. "My name Names have power. He explained each word, clearly costing him precious energy. Your baptismal name was your anchor, your true identity, that the entity could not erase. Elena nodded slowly, processing this. I did something terrible, didn't I? That ritual. Desperate people make desperate choices. Father Jimenez wheezed. But you fought. At the end, you fought to come back. I heard Marco's voice, she said softly, and something about a baby. Marco looked startled. I didn't say anything about a baby. I avoided his questioning gaze, remembering the words I'd whispered to wake him. Father Jimenez's eyes found mine, a knowing light in them, despite his fading strength. The holy water, he murmured. Give it to me. I retrieved the small silver flask from where it had fallen during the confrontation and placed it in his trembling hands. With great effort, he raised himself slightly and motioned Elena closer. Your hands, he instructed. She extended both hands, palms up. Father Jimenez poured a small amount of holy water into them, then placed his own hands over hers, enclosing the water between them. Life from water, he whispered, closing his eyes in concentration. Baptism, renewal, fertility. A soft glow emanated from between their joined hands, similar to but gentler than the reliquary's light. When Father Jimenez removed his hands, the water in Elena's palms had transformed, no longer clear, but faintly iridescent like mother of pearl. Drink, he instructed. Elena looked uncertain but obeyed, lifting her cupped hands to her lips and consuming the transformed water. As she swallowed, a subtle change passed over her color, returning to her cheeks, a spark reigniting behind her eyes. A blessing, Father Jimenez explained, sinking back exhausted. For what you truly sought. Understanding dawned on Elena's face, her hands moving instinctively to her abdomen. Marco stared in wonder, hope battling with disbelief in his expression. Is it possible? He asked Father Jimenez. The old priest smiled faintly. With God, all things are possible. But this gift comes with responsibility. Raise the child in light, never darkness. Elena and Marco nodded solemnly, tears streaming down both their faces. Father Jimenez turned his gaze back to me. Magdalena, you will continue. The work is important. I'm not ready, I protested. I don't know enough. I'm not strong enough. You are stronger than you know, he countered. Your past does not define you. Remember that. His eyes drifted toward the shattered windows through which the first pale light of dawn was becoming visible. Beautiful, he murmured. The darkness always gives way to light. With those words, Father Jimenez exhaled softly and did not inhale again. His hand went limp in mine, the reliquary finally slipping from his grasp to roll across the stone floor. Outside, birds began their morning songs, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred during the night. The chapel, despite its destruction, was suddenly filled with that quiet stillness that follows a passing storm, a strange, anticlimactic peace after such violence. Yet beneath that peace I felt something else, a watchfulness, a waiting, as if whatever had been driven out was not truly gone, but merely pushed back beyond some invisible boundary. I looked toward Elena, who sat cradled in Marco's arms, her expression serene despite the horror she had endured. Father Domingo was administering last rites to Father Jimenez, his voice steady despite his own injuries. Sister Beatrice moved among the retreatants, offering comfort and practical assistance. Light continued to stream through the broken windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like miniature galaxies in the air. The chapel, for all its devastation, felt cleansed somehow, sacred again. But as I watched a beam of sunlight touch the place where Elena had stood during her transformation, I noticed something troubling. A small dark stain remained on the stone floor, a perfect circle that the light seemed to bend around rather than illuminate. A mark, a reminder, a warning. And I knew with absolute certainty that our victory, while real, was incomplete. We had won the battle, but the war was far from over. possessed my witness to evil in a sacred place. Part 4. 3 months passed before I could sleep through the night without waking to phantom screams. 6 months before I stopped flinching at unexpected shadows. A year before I could enter a chapel without scanning for exits first. Some wounds heal more slowly than others. Some never heal at all. The official report submitted to the diocese described the events at Centro Espiritual Santa Teresa as a medical emergency complicated by structural failure. Elena had experienced an acute psychological episode triggered by emotional distress. The chapel's damage resulted from an electrical fire and previously undetected foundation issues. Father Jimenez had suffered a stress-induced cardiac event. Such convenient fictions. Such necessary lies. Father Domingo oversaw the documentation, carefully constructing a narrative the outside world could accept. The retreat participants signed confidentiality agreements, not that most needed encouragement to remain silent. Few wanted to relive what they had witnessed even in words. Some truths are not meant for public consumption, Father Domingo explained when I questioned the deception. The Church has always understood this, not to hide evil, but to prevent unnecessary fear. I wasn't convinced. Doesn't hiding the truth just make us more vulnerable if people knew what was possible? What would they do with that knowledge, Magdalena? He interrupted gently. Most would dismiss it as superstition. Others would be paralyzed by fear. A few might even be drawn to such power. Who does that serve? I had no answer then. Sometimes I still don't. Elena and Marco returned to their home in Monterrey. The doctors confirmed Elena's pregnancy 6 weeks after that night in the chapel. Against all medical odds, she had been told repeatedly that conception was impossible due to a congenital abnormality. A new life had taken root within her. A miracle, the physicians called it, shaking their heads in bewilderment. A blessing, Elena insisted, her hands protectively cradling the subtle curve of her abdomen when I visited them 3 months after the retreat. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps it was neither. Marco had recovered from his head injury, though a jagged scar remained hidden beneath his hair, a permanent reminder etched into flesh. Sometimes he would touch it absently while speaking, as if reassuring himself that what had happened was real. "We're moving to Guadalajara," he told me during that visit. "Elena's mother lives there. We think a fresh start would be good." I understood their desire to distance themselves from Monterrey, from the memories, from the lingering sense that something irrevocable had occurred. Part of me envied their ability to leave. "What about the child?" I asked carefully. "Have you considered what you'll tell them when they're older?" Elena and Marco exchanged a look I couldn't interpret, something between fear and fierce determination. "We'll tell them they're loved," Elena said firmly. "That they're a gift. Nothing else matters." I didn't press further. Who was I to question their choice? We all find different ways to live with our scars. Father Jimenez's funeral drew hundreds of mourners, most unaware of the true circumstances of his passing. The bishop delivered a eulogy celebrating his decades of service, his mentorship of younger clergy, his devotion to the marginalized. No mention was made of his other work, the battles fought in shadows, the souls rescued from darkness. Sister Beatrice approached me after the service, her weathered face solemn beneath her veil. "He left something for you," she said, pressing a small package wrapped in brown paper into my hands. "He arranged for it to be given to you if circumstances warranted." I unwrapped it that night in the privacy of my apartment. Inside was Father Jimenez's personal prayer book, a small, leather-bound volume worn smooth by decades of use. A letter was tucked between its pages, the handwriting shaky but legible. "Magdalena, if you are reading this, then I've gone to my reward, though perhaps sooner than either of us anticipated. Do not grieve over much. Death comes to us all, and I have lived a fuller life than most. You witnessed something few ever do and survived with your faith intact, no small achievement. What you experienced in that chapel will shape you for years to come in ways both obvious and subtle. Some will tell you to forget. Others will encourage you to deny what your senses revealed. Listen to neither. The entity you encountered was ancient and powerful, but not unique. There are others. There have always been others. They wait in the spaces between moments in the shadows, between heartbeats, patient and hungry and eternal. You may wonder why God permits such darkness to exist. I cannot answer this fully. No mortal can. But I believe that darkness exists not despite God's love, but because of it. Because true choice requires alternatives, because courage requires something to fear, because light is most visible against the deepest black. You have been marked, Magdalena, not cursed, but noticed. The entity knows your name now, and names have power, but remember, it knows only the name you currently bear. Your baptismal name remains protected, a shield you can use if needed. In my belongings, you will find a key to a storage facility in Mexico City. There I have gathered books and artifacts accumulated over 60 years of confronting what most pretend doesn't exist. This knowledge is now yours. Use it wisely. Share it selectively. Trust your instincts about whom to tell and whom to shield. One final warning, Elena's child. Watch over them from a distance. The blessing I bestowed was genuine, but blessings can be twisted. The entity may be banished, but its influence may linger in ways we cannot predict. The child itself is innocent. Remember that above all else. You are stronger than you believe, Magdalena. Faith is not the absence of doubt, but perseverance despite it. I go to my rest, knowing that what I began continues in capable hands. With eternal hope, Father Tomas Jimenez. I read the letter 7 times that night, each reading revealing new layers of meaning, new causes for both comfort and concern. By morning, I had made my decision. 2 weeks later, I left my position at the parish and enrolled in theological studies at the Pontifical University in Mexico City. If I was to continue Father Jimenez's work, and I knew with certainty that I needed more than faith and first-hand experience, I needed knowledge. The storage facility contained exactly what Father Jimenez had promised: hundreds of books, journals, and artifacts cataloging encounters with the inexplicable. Some dated back centuries, preserved with meticulous care. His personal journals alone filled 3 boxes each entry, documenting confrontations with forces that defied conventional understanding. I immersed myself in this education, balancing formal theological training with the shadow curriculum Father Jimenez had assembled. Days were spent in lecture halls and libraries. Nights found me poring over grimoires and first-hand accounts of possessions, hauntings, and manifestations from across the globe. Professor Alvarez, my faculty advisor, noticed my dual course of study despite my efforts at discretion. "You're walking a dangerous path, Señorita Cortez," he remarked during a private meeting in his office. "The Church tolerates the ritual of exorcism, but those who delve too deeply into demonology often find themselves viewed with suspicion." "I'm merely researching historical perspectives on evil," I replied carefully. His smile was knowing but not unkind. "As you wish. But should you require guidance in these historical perspectives, my office door is open. Some of us understand that orthodoxy and truth are not always perfect companions." I never explicitly accepted his offer, but over the following months, books appeared in my campus mailbox, rare texts on apocryphal traditions, comparative studies of exorcism rituals across cultures, psychological analyses of possession cases. Professor Alvarez never mentioned them, merely nodding slightly when our paths crossed in hallways or courtyards. 1 year after the retreat, I received a card from Elena and Marco. Inside was a photograph of their daughter, Maria Luz Catalina. She had Elena's delicate features and Marco's gentle eyes. Nothing in her cherubic face suggested anything but pure innocence. Yet something in the photograph disturbed me in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. I studied it for hours before identifying the source of my unease. The shadows in the background seemed to bend toward the child as if drawn by some invisible force. A trick of light, perhaps. A coincidence of exposure and development. That's what I told myself as I placed the photograph in a drawer rather than displaying it on my shelf. 3 weeks later, Professor Alvarez didn't appear for our scheduled meeting. When I inquired at the department office, the secretary informed me he had taken an unexpected leave of absence. His apartment was found empty. Books still on shelves, clothes still in closets, a half-finished cup of coffee on his desk, as if he had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. The police investigation revealed nothing. No evidence of foul play, no financial irregularity suggesting planned departure, no communication with friends or family indicating intention to leave. He had simply vanished. I alone knew the significance of what had been found on his office walls, hundreds of tiny symbols carved into the plaster, forming protective circles and wards against intrusion. The investigators dismissed them as eccentric artistic expression. I recognized them as desperate defenses against something that had found him anyway, something that had noticed him because of his connection to me. That night I dreamed of Elena's child. In the dream, Maria Luz sat in a circle of scorched earth, playing with a doll that resembled Elena too closely for comfort. As I approached, she looked up at me with eyes that shifted from brown to milky white and back again. "He says hello," the child said in my dream, her voice layered with familiar undertones that made my blood freeze. "He says he misses you, Magdalena." I woke, gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, the smell of sulfur so strong I was convinced it was real, until the pre-dawn air gradually cleared it from my senses. The next day I began making arrangements to visit Guadalajara. Elena sounded surprised when I called, but welcomed the visit with apparent warmth. "Luz is growing so quickly," she said. "She'll be walking any day now." It would be wonderful for her to meet her madrina. I had forgotten that Elena and Marco had named me as godmother, a decision made in the emotional aftermath of that night, a connection neither of us had actively maintained in the months since. The reminder sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Guadalajara greeted me with unseasonable rain, dark clouds obscuring the mountain streets slick with water that reflected shattered fragments of neon and streetlights. The taxi driver crossed himself when I gave him Elena and Marco's address. "Bad neighborhood?" I asked, suddenly alert. He shrugged uncomfortably. "Not bad. Just strange things happen near that street. Lights that shouldn't be there. Sounds that make no sense. My cousin's dog won't walk on that block, just sits and howls if they try to go that way." I tipped him generously when we arrived, noting how quickly he drove away after I retrieved my luggage. The house itself looked ordinary enough, a modest two-story structure with a small front garden and fresh paint. Nothing in its appearance suggested anything unusual. Marco answered the door, his smile genuine if slightly strained around the edges. He had aged more than a year, would explain new lines around his eyes, gray, threaded through his once solid black hair. "Magdalena," he embraced me warmly. "It's been too long." "You look well," I lied politely. "How is fatherhood treating you?" A shadow passed briefly across his face. "It's an adventure. Every day brings something new." The interior of the house was meticulously maintained, almost obsessively so. No dust on surfaces, no items out of place. The walls were lined with religious imagery, crosses, icons, and prints of saints in quantities that exceeded typical Mexican Catholic devotion. Every doorway had a small crucifix mounted above it. Every windowsill held a small container of what I recognized as blessed salt. Protective measures, barriers against intrusion. Elena appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on an apron. Her transformation was even more striking than Marco's. Though she had regained her physical health, something in her eyes had changed, a watchfulness, a wariness that never fully abated, even when she smiled and embraced me. "It's so good to see you," she said. "Luz is napping, but she should wake soon. Are you hungry? I made pozole." The domestic normalcy felt surreal against the backdrop of shared trauma and my growing sense of unease. We sat at the dining table making careful conversation about neutral topics, my studies, Marco's work as a contractor, the weather in Mexico City versus Guadalajara. The pozole was delicious, but I found myself struggling to eat, my appetite diminished by the weight of unasked questions. Finally, when Marco stepped away to answer a phone call, I leaned toward Elena. How are you really? I asked quietly. She glanced toward the hallway where Marco had disappeared, then back to me. We're managing, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Luz is special, demanding in ways I wasn't prepared for. Special how? Elena hesitated, absently touching a small medallion of Saint Benedict that hung around her neck, another protective symbol. She develops quickly, speaking in full sentences already, knowing things she shouldn't know. Sometimes I find her having conversations with empty corners of the room. My pulse quickened. Have you spoken to a priest? 3, she admitted. The first 2 suggested developmental specialist doctors, not exorcists. The third, he blessed the house but wouldn't return afterward, said he had other commitments. And Marco. He pretends everything is normal, works longer hours, avoids being alone with her. Her eyes filled with tears. I love my daughter Magdalena. With everything I am. But sometimes I fear, a child's voice interrupted from the doorway. Mama, who's this lady? Elena startled, hastily wiping her eyes before turning. Luz mi corazón. This is Magdalena, your madrina. Remember I told you she was visiting. Maria Luz Catalina looked exactly like her photographed delicate features. Gentle eyes, cherubic innocence in every line of her face. Yet something about her stillness unsettled me deeply. No child of barely 1 year should stand so perfectly poised, should observe with such careful calculation. Hello, Magdalena, she said, her pronunciation flawless. I've been waiting to meet you. I forced a smile. Hello, Luz. You're even prettier than your picture. She tilted her head slightly, studying me with uncommon intensity. You look exactly like I thought you would. He described you perfectly. Ice flooded my veins. Who did, sweetie? My friend, she replied simply. The one who whispers to me at night. He knows you. Elena paled visibly, her hand tightening around her medallion. Luz, remember what we talked about? About not mentioning your imaginary friends. He's not imaginary, Luz replied with absolute conviction. He's just waiting. Marco returned before I could respond, his phone call apparently concluded. His expression shifted subtly when he saw his daughter love mingled with something that looked distressingly like fear. Princess, he said with forced enthusiasm. You're awake. Did you say hello to your godmother? Yes, Papa. Luz smiled instantly, transforming into a perfectly normal child. Can I show her my room? Marco and Elena exchanged a quick glance. Of course, Elena said. But remember, Magdalena is tired from her journey. Don't keep her too long. Luz took my hand, her tiny fingers surprisingly cold against mine. Come see my toys, she said, pulling me toward the staircase. I followed, acutely aware of Marco and Elena watching us ascend, their postures tense with unspoken worry. Luz's bedroom was painted soft yellow, filled with typical children's furniture and toys. A bookshelf held picture books alongside titles that seemed advanced for her age, early readers, and even some chapter books. A collection of dolls sat arranged in a perfect semicircle on a child-sized table as if attending a meeting. This is a lovely room, I commented, trying to maintain a normal tone despite my growing discomfort. It's okay, Luz replied, closing the door behind us with deliberate care. The salt at the windows makes it hard for my friend to visit. Mama puts it there every night, but I move it sometimes. I knelt to her level, meeting her gaze directly. Luz, who is this friend you keep mentioning? Her expression changed subtly, still a child's face, but somehow older, knowing in ways that defied her chronological age. He doesn't have a name I can say, she explained matter-of-factly. It would hurt my mouth to try. But he knows you from the chapel. He says you helped send him away, but that's okay because he found a better way back. My heart hammered against my ribs. What does that mean, Luz, a better way back? She smiled, an expression that should have been innocent but somehow wasn't. Through me, of course. Babies are doors, didn't you know? Especially special babies like me. The room suddenly felt colder, the shadows in the corners deeper than they should have been in the afternoon light. He's not all the way here yet, Luce continued conversationally. Just pieces. Little pieces that came through when I was still in Mama. But he's getting stronger, especially when I sleep. I struggled to maintain my composure, to remember that I was speaking to a child, a potentially innocent vessel, rather than the entity itself. Does he hurt you, Luce? She looked genuinely surprised at the question. No, he's my friend. He teaches me things, shows me things, helps me do things I couldn't do alone. What kind of things? Her smile widened. Would you like to see? Before I could answer, she turned toward the semicircle of dolls. With a flick of her wrist, a gesture no 1-year-old should be capable of executing with such precision, the dolls rose several inches above the table, hovering in perfect formation. Mama and Papa don't like when I do this, Luce said calmly as the dolls began to rotate slowly in midair. They think it means something bad, but it's just physics, really, manipulating forces. My friend explains it better than I can. I fought the urge to run from the room, to flee the house entirely. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate breath and reached for the small silver crucifix I now wore constantly around my neck. Luce, what you're doing isn't natural for a little girl. I think your friend might not be telling you the truth about who he is. The dolls dropped suddenly, clattering across the table and floor. Luce's expression darkened. A child's face contorted with adult rage. You're just like the priest Mama brings, she said, her voice deepening subtly. Always trying to send him away, but he belongs with me. We made a deal. What deal, Luce? You're just a baby. You can't make deals. Not me, she clarified, the rage dissolving as quickly as it had appeared. Mama, she wanted a baby so badly she promised anything. My friend just collected on the promise. A chill ran through me as pieces connected. Elena's desperate ritual months before the retreat, not just an attempt to conceive, but a bargain. A door deliberately opened. Luce, listen to me, I said urgently. Whatever your friend tells you, he's not here to help you. He's using you to come back fully, to hurt people, including your parents who love you very much. For a moment, something flickered in Luce's eyes, genuine childlike confusion and fear. But he said I was special, that only I could help him. He's lying, sweetheart. That's what beings like him do. They lie to get what they want. Luce's lower lip trembled, a perfectly normal child's response to distress. I don't want to hurt Mama and Papa. I know you don't, I assured her cautiously, reaching out to take her small hands in mine. And we can help make sure that doesn't happen. But you need to tell your friend he's not welcome anymore. The change was instantaneous. Luce's hands turned icy in mine, her posture rigidifying as if pulled by invisible strings. When she spoke again, her voice emerged as a horrifying, multi-layered sound I remembered too well. She can't hear you anymore, Magdalena, said the thing using Luce's mouth. Such a tender little mind, so easily set aside. I released her hands and stepped back, fumbling for my crucifix. You have no right to this, child. Luce, or what controlled her, laughed, that same terrible sound that had filled the chapel a year ago. Rights were well beyond such concepts. This vessel was promised to me. A life for a life. Elena understood the terms even if she pretended otherwise. She never intended to surrender her child to you. Intention is irrelevant. The ritual was performed, blood was spilled, words were spoken, a door was opened. Luce's body moved with that same unsettling, puppet-like quality I had witnessed in Elena. And this time I've chosen a younger, more malleable host, one I can shape from the beginning. I held up the crucifix, my hand trembling but determined. In the name of Christ, I command you to release this child. The entity, using Luce's form, laughed again. Your little symbols have no power here, Magdalena. This is not a full possession you can simply exorcise. This is a claiming gradual, methodical, and entirely within the terms Elena agreed to. She would never agree to surrender her child. Not in those words, perhaps, but desperation makes for poor contract negotiation. Anything, she promised. Anything for a child of my own. Such dangerous language. I heard footsteps on the stairs, Marco or Elena coming to check on us. The entity noticed too, Luce's head turning sharply toward the door. Our conversation must end for now, it said, voice returning to a childlike register. But we'll speak again, Magdalena. After all, your family now. Her madrina, bound by sacred obligation to her spiritual welfare. The thing inside Luz smiled, using her innocent face. I do appreciate the irony. The door opened, revealing Elena's concerned expression. Everything okay? You've been up here a while? In the instant before Elena fully entered the room, I saw Luz's eyes flash milky white, then return to normal brown. By the time Elena could see her daughter, Luz had transformed back into a perfectly ordinary child, smiling and reaching for a nearby stuffed animal. We're just playing Mama, she said sweetly. Magdalena likes my toys. Elena's relief was palpable but tinged with lingering concern. She had seen enough to recognize patterns even if she couldn't bring herself to fully acknowledge what they meant. Dinner will be ready soon, she said. Why don't you help Papa set the table, Luz? Okay. The child skipped past us with perfect innocence, pausing at the door to look back at me. For a split second, something ancient and malevolent gazed out from behind those childish eyes, a silent promise that our conversation wasn't over. Once Luz was safely downstairs, Elena turned to me, her voice barely above a whisper. You saw it, didn't you, the change in her? I nodded, unwilling to lie. How long has it been happening? Since birth, Elena admitted, tears forming. At first, just little things, unusual alertness, developmental leaps that doctors called precocious, but felt wrong somehow. Then objects moving when no one touched them, voices coming from her room when she was alone. She pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. What have I done, Magdalena? What did I bring into this world? I placed my hands on her shoulders, forcing her to meet my gaze. Listen to me, Elena. Your daughter, the real Luz, is still in there. What you're seeing is influence, not complete possession. There's still time to fight this. How the priests won't help. The doctors think I'm having postpartum psychosis. Marco is in denial. I have nowhere to turn. You have me, I said with more confidence than I felt. And through me you have Father Jimenez's knowledge. We can find a way to separate Luz from this influence before the integration becomes permanent. Hope flickered briefly in Elena's eyes. Is that possible? I believe it is. But we need to act soon, and you'll have to be strong enough to face what's happening without flinching from the truth. She straightened, something of her former resilience returning. For my daughter, I can face anything. I squeezed her shoulders reassuringly, though inwardly I questioned whether either of us truly understood what anything might entail. The remainder of my visit passed in a strange pantomime of normalcy. We ate dinner, played games, watched television, all while pretending not to notice Luz's occasional slips, knowledge beyond her years, physical capabilities that defied her development stage, shadows that moved against the light when she entered a room. That night in the guest bedroom, I barricaded the door with a chair and surrounded my bed with a circle of blessed salt I had brought in my luggage. I placed Father Jimenez's prayer book beneath my pillow and kept his crucifix in my hand as I attempted to sleep. Despite these precautions, the dream came. I stood in a vast darkness, featureless except for a single point of light in the distance. As I moved toward it, the light resolved into a familiar scene, the chapel at Centro Espiritual Santa Teresa, restored to its condition before that terrible night. Luz sat alone at the center, playing with a doll that looked disturbingly like a miniature version of Elena during her possession, distorted features, elongated limbs, milky white eyes. He says you can't save me, Luz said without looking up. He says it's too late. The claiming is almost complete. He's lying, I insisted, approaching cautiously. There's always hope, Luz. Always a way back to the light. She continued, playing her small hands, manipulating the doll with disturbing precision. Did you know there are spaces between spaces, places that aren't really places? That's where he waits. Where he's always waited. Not hell, not earth, but the in-between. Luz, listen to me. You need to fight his influence. Find your true self beneath his lies. But what if there is no true self? She asked, finally looking up. Her eyes shifted continuously between brown and milky white. What if I've always been part him, born from a bargain shaped by his presence since conception? Before I could respond, the chapel began to darken, shadows creeping in from the corners, like living things consuming the light until only Luce remained illuminated. "He's coming," she said calmly. "He wants to meet you properly this time. No priest to interfere, no ritual to bind him." The darkness thickened, taking on texture and substance. I tried to run but found myself rooted in place, unable to move, as the shadows coalesced into a vaguely humanoid shape behind Luce. A voice emerged from that darkness, the same multi-layered sound I remembered, but clearer now, more focused. "Magdalena," it said, using my name like a weapon. "How kind of you to visit." I struggled to speak, to move, to wake myself from what I knew must be a dream. The entity controlling Luce seemed to sense my efforts. "This is no ordinary dream," it explained, using Luce's small hand to gesture around the dissolving chapel. "This is a meeting of minds, yours, mine, the child's, what little remains of it, a conversation across planes." "What do you want?" I finally managed. "Want?" The darkness rippled with what might have been laughter. Such a simple question for such a complex answer. To exist fully, to experience this realm through untainted senses, to complete what began with Elena but was interrupted by your meddling priest. "You won't succeed," I said, struggling to project confidence I didn't feel. "Luce is innocent. Her soul is stronger than you know." "Innocence is precisely what makes her perfect," the entity countered. "A blank canvas, unblemished by sin or doubt or the thousand little compromises that mark adult souls. Through her I can experience this world anew. Through her I can influence beyond a single vessel." The implications chilled me more deeply than any physical cold. "You're planning to use her to access others?" "Of course. A child is trusted. A child is welcome in homes and schools and churches. A child can touch other children, spreading influence like ripples in still water, from one to many, from many to all." Luce's expression remained placid as the entity spoke through her, her small hands continuing to manipulate the distorted doll. Only her eyes betrayed the struggle within, flashing between normal brown and that terrible milky white with increasing frequency. "You underestimate humanity's capacity for resistance," I said, trying to reach the real Luce beneath the influence. "And you underestimate the power of free will. Luce can choose to reject you no matter what bargain her mother made." The darkness surrounding Luce pulsed with annoyance. "Free will is an illusion created by limited perspective. The child is mine by right, claimed before birth, shaped through development. What you call the real Luce is merely a temporary construction, a larval stage before true metamorphosis." As it spoke, the chapel reconstructed itself around us, but wrong proportions, distorted colors, inverted crucifixes hanging upside down, a mockery of sacred space. "This conversation grows tiresome," the entity said, Luce's voice merging more completely with its multi-layered tones. "I did not bring you here to debate theology. I brought you here to offer a choice." "What choice?" "Leave, return to Mexico City. Continue your studies and forget what you've seen here. In exchange, I will ensure Elena and Marco live long, comfortable lives alongside their special daughter." "And if I refuse?" Luce's face split into a smile that stretched too wide for her small features. "Then I will take them first while you watch, the father through despair, the mother through guilt, and then when you understand the cost of defiance, I will come for you as well." "You're afraid," I realized suddenly. "You're afraid I can actually help Luce." The darkness surrounding her rippled violently. "Afraid of a half-trained theologian playing at exorcist? Your arrogance exceeds your wisdom, Magdalena." But I had seen it, the momentary disruption in its confidence, the flicker of uncertainty. There was a way to save Luce. The entity wouldn't have confronted me directly if there wasn't. "I will find a way to free her," I promised, focusing on Luce's eyes in the moments they returned to normal brown. "Whatever it takes." Your predecessor made similar claims, the entity replied coldly. Father Jimenez believed himself invincible too, right until his heart gave out. How do you think your courage compares to his experience? It doesn't, I admitted, but I have something he didn't. And what might that be? I stepped forward, breaking the invisible restraint that had held me in place. His knowledge, his preparation, and most importantly, time to help Luz before the claiming is complete. For the first time, genuine anger distorted Luz's features. You will regret this choice, Magdalena Cortez. When the blood of this family stains your hands, remember you were offered mercy. The dream chapel began to collapse around us, stone walls crumbling, wooden beams splintering. Luz's form started to fade, the darkness surrounding her pulsing with malevolent intensity. 3 days, the entity said as everything dissolved. You have 3 days before the claiming becomes irreversible. After that, nothing will separate me from this vessel. I woke with a gasp, sheets soaked with sweat, the crucifix still clutched in my hand. The digital clock on the nightstand read 3:17 a.m., the exact time Elena had reported waking during the retreat, convinced someone was calling her name. Moonlight filtered through the guest room window, casting long shadows across the floor. The circle of blessed salt remained intact, but something was wrong. The chair I had wedged against the door now sat neatly against the wall. The door itself stood slightly ajar, a thin slice of darkness visible through the gap. And on the floor, just inside the doorway but outside my protective circle, sat Luz's doll, the same one from my dream, its features subtly distorted to resemble Elena during her possession. I lay frozen, listening for any sound of movement in the hallway beyond. Nothing. Just the ordinary nighttime creaks of the house settling and the distant hum of traffic from the main road. Carefully, I slipped from the bed, keeping the crucifix extended before me. The salt circle had protected me during sleep, but I would need to leave its boundary to investigate. Each step toward the door felt like moving through mud, my body resisting what my mind compelled it to do. I nudged the door wider with my foot, revealing an empty hallway. Luz's bedroom door at the far end stood open, spilling moonlight across the corridor. Too open, too deliberate, an invitation or a trap. Decision crystallized within me. I wouldn't confront the entity again tonight, not alone, not unprepared. Instead, I carefully closed and locked my door, reinforcing it with the chair once more. I left the doll where it lay, unwilling to touch it. Returning to bed, I opened Father Jimenez's prayer book, searching its pages for guidance. Near the back, a section titled "The Uncompleted Claiming" caught my attention, a ritual specifically designed for cases where demonic influence had begun but not yet achieved full possession. The ritual required specific components: blessed oil from Jerusalem water, from a child's baptism soil from consecrated ground, and most crucially, the true name of the entity attempting the claiming. The first 3 items I could obtain. The last presented a far greater challenge. Father Jimenez had tried to extract the entity's name during Elena's exorcism, but had only received the evasive answer of Legion. For the ritual to work, I would need its actual name, its specific individual identifier in the hierarchy of darkness. As I studied the ritual requirements, a small note in Father Jimenez's handwriting caught my eye in the margin. The vessel always knows the name, even when the conscious mind does not. In children, this knowledge often emerges through play or dreams. Luz knew the entity's name. Somewhere in her partially claimed consciousness, she held the key to her own liberation. I spent the remainder of the night planning, praying, and preparing. By dawn, I had outlined a strategy that would require Elena and Marco's complete cooperation, specialized items from Mexico City, and most challenging of all, a way to extract information from Luz without alerting the entity to my intentions. 3 days, 72 hours to save a child's soul. When I finally emerged from my room the following morning, I found the house unnaturally quiet. The doll that had been left outside my door was gone. In the kitchen, Elena sat alone at the table, staring blankly into a cold cup of coffee. "Where are Marco and Luz?" I asked, instantly alert. Elena looked up, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Marco took her to the park. I told him everything last night, about what I did before the retreat, about the bargain I made. He didn't believe me until what, Elena? Until Luz spoke to him in his father's voice. She shuddered visibly. His father who died when Marco was 12. Sharing details only his father could have known. I sat beside her, taking her trembling hands in mine. Elena, listen to me carefully. We can help Luz, but I need to return to Mexico City immediately to gather specific items. While I'm gone, there are preparations you and Marco must make. Anything, she said, then flinched at her own word choice. Whatever it takes, she amended. The entity gave me 3 days before the claiming becomes permanent. We'll need every hour of that time. Hope and fear warred in Elena's expression. Is it truly possible to save her without harming her? I thought of Father Jimenez's ritual of the warnings and cautions that accompanied it. The truth was that no such intervention came without risk. The entity was thoroughly entwined with Luz's developing consciousness. Separating them could damage her in ways we couldn't predict. But the alternative was unthinkable, complete surrender of an innocent child to an entity of pure malevolence. Yes, I said, with more certainty than I felt. It's possible, but the path ahead will be difficult. You and Marco must be prepared for what might happen. We are, Elena assured me, her spine straightening with renewed determination. She's our daughter. We'll do whatever is necessary to save her soul. As I packed my small suitcase for the return to Mexico City, I caught a glimpse of movement in the hallway mirror, a dark shape that shouldn't have been there watching me from reflections within reflections. When I turned to look directly, nothing was visible. But when I faced the mirror again, I could still sense it lurking just beyond the glass, observing, calculating. The entity knew I had rejected its offer. It knew I was planning resistance. Yet it made no move to stop my departure, which concerned me more than any direct confrontation would have. Such confidence suggested it believed its hold on Luz was already too strong to break. Perhaps it was right. Perhaps I was attempting the impossible with incomplete knowledge and insufficient experience. As I descended the stairs with my suitcase, I found Luz sitting alone in the living room, her back to me, that same doll clutched in her small hands. I know what you're planning, she said, without turning around, her voice once again layered with those terrible undertones. It won't work. The ritual is incomplete in the book. The old priest understood this too late. I paused on the stairs, my knuckles white around the suitcase handle. If you're so certain of failure, why bother warning me? Luz turned, then her face, a perfect mask of childlike innocence, betrayed only by the milky whiteness that had completely claimed her eyes. Because your suffering will be more exquisite if you fail with hope intact. She tilted her head in that unsettling bird-like movement. 3 days, Magdalena. Though perhaps I should tell you the truth, the claiming has progressed faster than expected. Your deadline may be optimistic. I don't believe you, I said, continuing down the stairs with forced steadiness. You wouldn't have offered me the choice to leave if your victory was already assured. Something flickered across Luz's face, a momentary disruption in the entity's control. For less than a heartbeat, I glimpsed the real child beneath the influence, frightened and desperate. "Help me," she whispered in a voice entirely her own before the entity reasserted control, milky whiteness flooding back into her eyes. An interest in theory, the entity continued as if the interruption had never occurred. Perhaps we'll discuss it further when you return, if the vessel still remembers who you are by then. I reached the bottom of the stairs, maintaining distance between us. Her name is Luz, not the vessel. She has a soul and identity, a right to her own existence. For now, the entity agreed with terrible pleasantness. But identities are such malleable things, especially in the very young. By the time you return, there may be nothing left of Luz at all. I wanted to argue further, to assert confidence I didn't fully feel, but Elena appeared from the kitchen, stopping short when she saw her daughter. "Luz, who are you talking to?" The entity withdrew instantly, leaving only a normal child blinking up at her mother with perfectly ordinary brown eyes. "Just my doll, Mama," she said innocently, "and saying goodbye to Madrina Magdalena." Elena's expression revealed her awareness that she had interrupted something significant. She moved to stand between Luz and me, a mother's protective instinct overriding her fear. "The taxi should be here soon," she said to me, her voice carefully neutral. "Marco wants to speak with you before you leave." I nodded, grateful for the interruption despite the entity's veiled threat. "I'll call you when I reach Mexico City," I promised. "Remember everything we discussed." As Elena led Luz toward the kitchen, the child glanced back at me over her shoulder. The smile she gave me wasn't hers, too knowing, too ancient for her innocent face. "Safe travels, Madrina," she said sweetly. "Don't forget to count the hours." The taxi arrived minutes later. Marco helped load my suitcase, then pulled me aside while Elena distracted Luz inside the house. I didn't believe it at first, he admitted, his voice low and strained. "I thought Elena was having some kind of breakdown. But last night—" He trailed off, visibly struggling with the memory. "I know," I said. "Elena told me what happened." He nodded, relief evident that he wouldn't have to articulate the horror himself. "Can you really help her? Can Luz be saved?" "I believe so," I replied. "But you and Elena must follow my instructions exactly. No deviations, no matter how strange they might seem." "We will. Just—" he hesitated. "Hurry back. Things are escalating quickly. Last night was the first direct manifestation, but I fear it won't be the last." I squeezed his arm reassuringly. 3 days. I'll return within 48 hours. Until then, maintain the salt lines, keep blessed items close, and most importantly, don't leave Luz alone, not even for a moment." He nodded grimly. "God go with you, Magdalena." "And with your family?" I replied, sliding into the taxi. As we pulled away, I looked back at the house. Luz stood at the upstairs window, the doll clutched against her chest, watching my departure with unnatural stillness. Even from this distance, I could sense her eyes had returned to that milky white emptiness. A child's hand raised in farewell, but the gesture felt more like a promise than a goodbye. A promise that our confrontation had only just begun. And as the taxi turned the corner, removing the house from view, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. For in the rear window's reflection, just for an instant, I saw not my own face looking back at me, but Father Jimenez's weathered, sorrowful, and undeniably dead. 3 days, his reflection mouthed silently. "If you're lucky." Then there was only my own terrified face staring back from the glass as the taxi carried me away from one nightmare and toward the preparation for an even greater one. The war for Luz's soul had begun in earnest, and despite my brave words to Marco and Elena, I wasn't at all certain we could win.